Greetings, Victorians, and welcome to our first developer stream for The Great Wave. I'm Lino Claudius, I'm the lead game designer, and here with me today is Hansi. Like previously, I think last year? No, it was for Iberian Twilight, right?
It was when we last. Indeed,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Hansi is one of our narrative designers and was basically in more or less in charge of developing the Japan content. Yeah. So, of course, as we've announced, we want to do an interview today with Drachinifel, who was consulting with us on the everything Navy, basically, all the boats and and whatnot. He's sadly a bit late because I think he's traveling. But he should be with us in a couple of minutes, and then somebody will just come in and get the setup, and then we'll basically have our interview with him. And until then, we figured it would be nice if we could just, have a little chat among us and maybe talk about how the production has gone for us. Could be interesting, right?
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you who don't know who Drachinifel is, he's essentially a content creator, historical author, engineer mixed into one body.
Yeah.
Very knowledgeable guy, and he's been a great asset for us whenever we've been working with anything boat related for this DLC.
Yeah, it was amazing to have him, and we also worked with him over quite the extended period of time. We had, 5 sessions in total over the course of like multiple months and multiple hours each, and it was really fantastic to just be able to throw any questions you had, basically, that you couldn't easily get an answer to him, and you would get an answer. That was really a fantastic help. And especially what I really appreciated is that he also was able to help the art team, right, with the references and so on. That was like fantastic work that he could really specify like what gun setup could have theoretically been used and so on.
Yes, exactly. So all the up gun, down gun variants and their graphical equivalent is basically the product of a lot of thought into alternate designs and sort of at least half realistic considerations. But of course, as with all of these things, when reality meets video game design, compromises will have to be made. But I think I'm reasonably happy with what we've ended up with in the end.
Yeah, I'm really excited. You got to see a lot of it in our dev diary yesterday that we showed on the art side and music. And that, if you haven't seen that, you can check it out. Take a closer look at basically our final version for some of this. But yeah, so maybe the reality check that you also had to endure when you were working with me is actually quite interesting.
Yes. I think it's fair to say that I belong more to the historical correctness grognard side of things. And we've had a lot of, and you belong to more of the school of practical game design, and we've had a lot of interactions, and I've had a lot of interactions with art in turn.
Yes.
And we will have discussions where we're like, well, we want this and this design to come in, and it's important that this and this rigging is represented here and here. And then an artist will perhaps go, it's a bit tall. What if I just slice it in half? That will look much prettier. And you kind of have to come to terms with this in some way or form. Yeah. But usually we've been able to find pretty good compromises across the board, I would say.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm as I mentioned, I am really happy with the kind of final result that we landed on. And I get it also from an artist perspective, right? It's like you have like 26 pixels times 26 pixels or something, and then you're faced with like, can we add 3 more sails here and on the side? And
I'm sorry, this boom didn't exactly exist in this configuration.
Exactly.
No, but
they're doing a great job at abstracting our desires into an icon that you can read.
Exactly, and the 3D models. Like I was looking at the animations of the ships firing the other day. It looks absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. That was one of my really big hopes for this release, that we could really elevate the ship mechanics with audiovisual support. And there's our trusty helper. Okay.
Hello. We have no Drac yet, but I'm just adjusting audio levels based on chat feedback.
Sure.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, say hi. Yeah, no, exactly. Like I really like the firing and the explosions and the damage model. I'm not actually sure we've shown that one yet, but like the ships will have like visible damage when they get damaged and so on. It's pretty cool. Our art director put a lot of effort into that, and it's really nice.
Yeah, I think it really showed in the art dev diary.
Yeah.
All the passion they've put into this, and honestly, it looks so good.
Yeah, it looks fantastic. I think it might be my new favorite kind of like piece of Victoria art that we've done.
It's also been very pleasing to work with models that are based on actual historical ships more closely. I think some of our earlier design has been more vague, almost giving it a little bit of an anno feel at times. But we made a decision now to go with real ships forming the basis of our models, and realistic configurations of these real ships forming the upgrade and downgrade range, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the end result is just, again, I keep repeating myself, but it does look very, very nice.
It's very cool. Yesterday in Discord, as a reaction to reading the dev diary, one player asked, like, why does the pre-Dreadnought have these 2 towers there? And I'm like, yeah, because that's how the USS Virginia looked like.
Yes.
And then I posted an image, and then, because it's based on a real ship.
Most of these ships are basically us consulting with Drac and finding a selection of interesting and distinct ships that sort of fit their type well. And the Virginia is a good example of something that is very much far out there, because you have a main battery or a secondary battery mounted on top of a turret on top of a gun turret. I don't think there's many other ships that have done this.
And I also read up that this was proving to be really ineffective, because like firing the one gun meant the other gun could not fire as well, and so on. So
I think there's a good reason they did it, and ended up doing it for more of them. And we had a long discussion also about the modern ironclad, whether or not we should use the Hosh as a reference. We have basically a tumble home crew at the company who feel very strongly, correctly, about us having tumble home designs in the game, and then we have very boring people like Lino, who think that the model are too outrageous.
I mean, the Hosh looks really special. It's a special boy kind of ship.
It's a beautiful boy.
But I like the setup that we've created, because we basically tried to not only take British ships, for example, right? Like that was one of our main motivations, that you could actually see a wide kind of like selection or spread of different ship types. And then the Hosh made it in, and the USS Virginia made it in, and so on. So I think we've taken some inspiration from a lot of different kind of like design schools, basically.
Yes, we've tried to get a good spread, but it will be said that the naming conventions of everything, the name of the modules and the name of the components that make up the ship, all follow Royal Navy standards. So we got the Victorian perspective in there as well, even though we had a bit of a spread. Yeah,
as Hansi mentioned earlier, right? It's about making a compromise oftentimes, and in this case, we felt like we needed some generally applicable structure for these modifications, which we then followed. So that makes sense. But yeah, maybe you actually want to talk about the spread, like some other inspirations, maybe that people would not have expected. Maybe
in the selection of the models we chose.
Yeah.
Well,
or what's your favorite, for example?
Favorite? That's a very good example. I mean, like we already talked about the Hosh.
Yeah.
Just because it looks so distinct, it is quite possibly one of my favorite models.
Fair enough.
But there is something very pleasing also about the model that we have for the early ironclad. Again, a French design. It's the Magenta class or the Solferino class of early ironclads, because it is essentially just a ship of the line made of metal. It has 2 gun decks, as like a traditional ship of the line might have had, but it is also clearly just metal ironclad. It looks like a really as it is, an intermediate design, and it just looks incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting if you're into Studio Ghibli films, you can clearly see where the animators got drew a lot of their inspiration from.
It's Victoria 3.
It is exactly, it's Victoria 3. They've anticipated this DLC and looked at the designs. But no, a lot of the pre-Dreadnoughts, and especially of the French school, have had a very clear impact on the way they chose to visualize the ships in the Ghibli films.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I didn't know that. Not watched too many Ghiblis at the moment. Maybe we should also just take some questions from chat while we still have an opportunity here. We're still waiting for Drac to arrive. I can't really read them, so like I'm quite serious. Like my glasses need to be updated.
We are both rather visually impaired, I'm afraid. But I'm a slightly better shape than Lino,
Yes,
just because I went to the optician more recently.
Yeah, I need to wait for the next major update.
So if there are any questions ahead of Drac joining, then feel free to post them now, and we'll do our very best to answer them.
Yeah, exactly.
Hotfix your glasses. Have you considered this, Lino?
Yeah, I really should. I couldn't prioritize it high enough yet. It's not a must fix yet. It's it's like medium priority.
Will Drake's Passage get appropriate debuffs to encourage Pacific Atlantic fleets and incentivize the Panama Channel? I think just the travel distance alone is a pretty solid argument for setting up the Panama Canal. Really.
Yeah, I would say so. Now that travel distance actually matters a lot more, it has become a lot more impactful in that regard. Because previously it was like it didn't matter what kind of ships you had and so on, right? Like they would just travel from one node to the other in the exact same time and so on. And now we've kind of like slowed it down a fair amount. So like ship traveling from, I don't know, Great Britain to the Pacific or whatnot, it would take a lot longer than before. And then you can really cut down on some travel time there. So yeah.
Someone's asking about which films you can Ghibli films you can see battleships in, and there's some very good examples. My favorite ones in Howl's Moving Castle. You can see a fair bit of them, and pay close attention to the ships in the bay there.
Interesting. Do you think there's any relation there between like the actual Japanese history and their relation to other countries when it comes to the ship design? Or no? This is just that looked cool.
The early, it's kind of veering into something else, but the early Japanese, Imperial Japanese Navy is very much an import navy.
Yeah.
You contract Western companies, usually British companies, because of the special relationship between Britain and Japan, to construct your ships and then gradually build up the native capabilities to produce your own ships. But it does take a while before this happens. The Mikasa, for example, is of British build. It's not a native Japanese ship.
Yeah, it had a sister ship, right? If I'm not mistaken. I want to say there was a connection. There was another, I think, a British-owned ship, and it was like the sister ship. Basically, it was I forgot. Yeah. I forgot. I just my brain is also a bit fuzzy these days. Any more questions from chat, maybe?
They want us to tease Easter eggs, but that's not how Easter eggs work.
Yeah, exactly.
If we tease Easter eggs.
I don't know.
No.
I don't think so. I also prefer that we just see a Reddit post one day and be like, oh my god, they added this.
Yes.
You know, that's pretty cool for us as well. And that's also why I don't want to spoil everything in the dev diaries. You know, like many people have asked like about the exact effects of the naval laws, for example, and I'm like, just discover it for yourself, you know. I like to keep some mystery.
Someone is asking about music, and we will have new music for this DLC actually.
Quite a bunch. I want to say it's like 23 minutes, something like that. So yeah, we have a couple of new tracks, as we've mentioned in the dev diary as well. We basically went for a different approach this time, where we, instead of having one music pack, we spread out the music a bit more across the releases of the volume, and that allows us basically to make more country-specific music, basically. So Japan will feature some era-appropriate music, or in some cases, these tracks are way older, actually, than like the Edo period or whatnot. And then but it would be music that would be known to the people at the time. And then you could have heard it maybe in a theater or, I don't know.
No, exactly. I think this serves, this does what music in a game like this should do. It kind of immerses you in the time period. It puts you in the time period. Someone's asking whether or not there will be a system where raiding fleets / submarines are not uncatchable like they are right now. And you could talk about visibility and detection and what have you.
Yes, exactly. No, they should not be uncatchable. Basically, the way this works is there's each ship has a visibility, or each fleet, I should say, maybe. And then there's a detection value on the opposing side, essentially. And those basically match against each other. And that determines a % chance per tick that is being rolled. That determines the chance of engaging in a battle. So if my fleet is trying to defend my convoys and I'm on an intercept mission, and you have a submarine fleet, you might be quite stealthy, but I still have a good chance every tick of engaging you.
I think it's also fair to say, maybe we've touched upon this earlier, but the aircraft carrier and also by extension the seaplane tender, the new model, has received quite a bit of work. Our old aircraft carrier was essentially a quite anachronistic one.
Mm-hmm.
It was an attack ship. It was more along the lines of World War II carriers, whereas our new one is primarily a tool for spotting and reconnaissance.
Yeah.
Though with the upgraded armament module, it's more tooled towards the interwar era experimentation with torpedo launched plane launched torpedoes. Torpedo launched planes.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a good point. That also shows the kind of like transition that we try to model in some of these ships. Obviously, most prominent in the early ships, the wooden ships, that then actually get to install steam engines and so on, right? So that's a pretty big shift from their like base function, basically, where they are purely powered by sails, to then install like a auxiliary steam engine, basically, to give them a bit more maneuverability in combat. Exactly. There was one thing I wanted to mention also on the detection versus visibility thing. If the submarine fleet engages in battle and actually shoots down some of the convoys, that means there's an actual naval battle spawned. So that also means that the submarines will have to spend some more time in battle, which allows you to, of course, like maneuver your fleet maybe into position and to intercept them before they engage the next battle. So there's also a pretty big change there in how this works now. Because supply ships basically spawn into battles, kind of like in Hearts of Iron, if you're familiar with that. Yeah, any more questions in chat? As I mentioned, I barely can read them.
I will be quite frank, I'm struggling a little bit myself. But
I can move in a bit closer here.
Do ships need repair after battle?
Yes, absolutely. If a ship is damaged, it will basically have certain hull damage or crew damage. And then they don't necessarily have to go right away, right? But they will basically have to go back to port, to a friendly port, and then also consume shipyard construction, basically, and more goods to be repaired to full strength again. And that depends on how much damage you've taken, right? If your ship is half destroyed, you will basically have to spend half a ship's construction effort again to get it to full strength again, which is quite impactful. And this also goes in hand with, if I just may add this, that most battles should not be a full stack wipe anymore, basically, but rather you have some losses on both sides, but both sides kind of retreat. They regroup, they maybe send home a ship or two to repair, and then they regroup and have another engagement, rather than I'm destroying your whole fleet in one go. So this is also a pretty major.
Just checking to see if our friend has showed up yet.
I don't know. Are we supposed to see it?
I don't
know. Oh no! I hope he's not been sitting in the lobby here now.
He should be calling us at some point. Yeah, that's him right there.
Yeah.
Right. Click.
Yeah. No, nothing here.
Hello. Let's try this. Hello.
I mean, he's offline, so I suspect he's actually still driving his car around the British Isles.
Well, having recently been to Britain, I can see why that could take a lot of time.
Yeah.
I've never been confused by roundabouts before I went to Britain.
Yeah. Yeah, I had the same feeling with Australia.
Hopefully he shows up soon and we can get him in.
Yeah. If not, then we will postpone this, basically. We'll just have a little more chat and then we'll find another date. Because I think it would be cool, obviously, right? Like, you guys seemed quite excited that we could get him on board. And, of course, he has a wealth of knowledge. So it would be a shame to not hear a bit about this. So then, in that case, we would like reschedule and would let you know on our social media.
Yeah. And meanwhile, we can continue and answer questions. Honestly,
we'll keep going for another 10 minutes or so, and then see.
Yeah. Someone is asking whether or not. Apologies, I have to lean in here a bit.
All good. Do we have new formables in this DLC? That's the question I can read.
It's difficult to do so with Japan.
Makes sense.
But we have dynamic names and dynamic flags for Japan,
right?
That change depending on the state of Japan. Essentially, got some pretty cool new things involving. I think we have something called a Tycoonit right now.
Ooh.
Which you can find out what it is in game essentially.
Okay. I'm not even sure what exactly that is referring to myself.
No,
so
it's also, I think, a term we more or less invented for this whole thing. I think we found it used in one old history wiki.
It sounds pretty cool. It's probably terrible, but yeah.
The Boshin War is pretty complicated in the sense that...
Oh, he's here.
Aha!
Sorry, the Boshin War is complicated.
It is complicated, but maybe we can talk about the Boshin War another time.
Yeah. So he says hello, so I'm just gonna check in.
Let's see if I can press the hot.
I don't think there's a particular button for it.
There is a button for it.
Was it?
There is a button. I forgot which one.
Hot code. Yeah. Just give us a moment here to see if he's actually ready to jump onto a call or not.
We do have a Three Mountains achievement, though given
a wiki version of it.
Slightly less ambitious than the original, but let's put it like that.
It's not really the game to...
Okay, I'm back. Sorry to interrupt. I hear we have somebody. Are we
ready?
Ready?
He says hello, but and then has not replied yet.
Let's call him. Because we need his face. Well, technically, we don't need his face, but his voice would be good at least.
I'm almost ready to see him driving in the car now.
Lost in the British countryside.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Okay. Oh yeah, there you are.
Hey, hang on. Let's then all we have to do is, and we could adjust this a little bit to be okay. And then we're gonna do this. We're doing it live, guys. We're doing it live. There we go. And then we'll just take. Yeah, you could live here.
I can move in closer to.
We don't need Lino.
Yeah, exactly.
As long as we have Drac, we don't need Lino. Okay. Sorry, chat.
Okay. We are currently live.
We're live right now. Sorry, Drac. Hello, I'm tech guy. I'm putting your face on the screen. And we just this could just live up
As
here.
you can tell, we are very serious actors.
Yeah. It's
all right.
Hot code interview edition.
It's working.
Yeah.
Huzzah.
Yeah. All right. Welcome to the stream, Drac. So great to have you back. We really appreciate you coming on at this complicated time for you. Yeah. So we've already started basically saying a bit about like what you do and where your expertise is from and why we of course consulted with you. But
I think they can't hear him. Some are saying in chat.
I'm back.
Oh, Okay.
I mean, I see some.
They don't hear Drac.
Okay, can you try saying something now?
It does say he's muted, but is he muted on his end or
Yeah,
our end?
yeah.
I don't know.
No, it's
Wait, say that again.
Right, we can hear you.
We
but
can hear
I
you.
think that was at his end.
Oh no. This is truly the hottest code of the hot code.
Hang on, I think I got the hot code button queued up on. Oh no, I deleted it. It's not there anymore.
Yeah, they still can't. They still cannot hear him.
Drac, say something.
Still not working, I'm afraid.
This is a settings issue on our end then.
Yeah, apologies for the technical difficulties, but
let's see.
Hmm.
Main pro. Okay, try it again.
Hello, testing, 1, 2.
Testing.
oh, yeah, we see output there.
We need to rely on chat.
Yeah, we will
feedback
rely
here.
on chat for sure.
4 to 6 seconds.
Aha! It works.
Huzzah! My work here.
Huzzah!
Thank you very much for the help, and yeah, sorry for the.
we gotta
problem.
get
Yeah. I'm on.
There we go.
We are very serious actors
Yeah,
and skilled, technically competent video game designers.
that is why we make video games, because we can't do anything else.
Yes.
As I mentioned, it's great to have you now for real. Yeah, maybe you want to quickly introduce yourself though to the audience for the like 5 people that might not know you, because I think the other ones are all big fans of yours.
Yeah, fair enough. So, I'm Drachinifel. I run the Naval History channel, Drachinifel. I'm a naval historian. I've written a book. Well, actually, that's a lie. I've written several books. One of them's been published so far. The other, I've got 2 more in kind of, if you like, post-production, and a bunch more lined up to do. They've written various naval articles and stuff. And, of course, I've worked with you guys.
Yeah.
It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah.
How did you find working with a video game company? Did you find it a frustrating experience at times, or was it smooth sailing, or a good mix?
It was all pretty smooth sailing, to be honest. I mean, I think what helped was that everyone was very clear as to what was expected of me before we had the first meetings. Because in my previous life as an engineer, I certainly have had my fair share of meetings where I've gone in going, I know they want to speak to me. I have no idea why.
Right.
I have no idea what they want to do. And then you end up spending an entire meeting just going, okay, why am I even here? And sometimes the answer is, well, you probably shouldn't be, but someone thought you should be. Whereas fortunately, with this series of meetings that we had, it was all very clearly laid out before in emails. This is what we want to do, so we could go straight in and actually talk about the project.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, for us, it was a tremendous help to just basically have the ability to just prepare all these questions, and then when we go into the session, we know we will get answers to all of those. That was a fantastic tool in our box, basically. So to say. Yeah.
Helps put a bit of weight behind our design decisions as well. If we feel that our options for upgrading or downgrading a ship, or our selection of ships has a bit of solid historical backing.
Yeah,
it helps both with our own well-being and also the player experience for sure, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, you had some more question prepared.
I did. I had a few questions that I wrote that I feel are related both to the video game Victoria 3 and to naval history in this period in general. So I thought I'd just ask you and have you talk about it at your own pace. So the first question is, how was sea power used as a tool of empire building in the Victorian era?
Right. So this changes quite a bit, because if we're talking about the Victorian era proper as opposed to the whole of the 19th century, obviously the Victorian era starts with Britain having the dominant position, but there is still a little bit of of colonial shenanigans going on. The colonies that have been captured and recaptured and etc. in the Napoleonic Wars have now, at the point Victoria comes to the throne, have been traded back. But there is a very common understanding that in the event of another major conflict, it's going to be pretty much how they've been doing warfare in the late 16th, 17th, and early 18th and into the 19th centuries, which is essentially invading another major European heartland is very difficult and very expensive, and you will need a huge army to do so. And therefore, most of the war is going to be colonial. So, and for that, you need a navy. Your navy needs to go out and transport your troops to seize the enemy colonies and prevent the enemy from doing the same to you. And that has a dual purpose. I mean, obviously, there's the morale effect of, hey, we've just nicked all your stuff. But also, a lot of the colonies are fairly important. So you've got things like, a lot of the Caribbean colonies providing sugar, for example, which is, it's not just an edible thing, it's also economically important. So if you take the enemy colonies, you are disrupting the enemy economy as well as enhancing your economy. See, the old classic, although it's beginning to peter out by the 19th century, of the Spanish taking infinite gold and silver from South America and so forth. So that's one way that sea power is quite vital. Another way is, of course, there's just general trade. It's not just trade between whatever colonial motherland there is and their colonies. There's trade between all the different countries, got the United States and so forth, and the various Scandinavian countries, although they don't have big empires, overseas empires of their own, they are still very important. And up until, I mean, even past the 1860s to a certain extent, but certainly up until the 1860s, when everyone is either wholly or primarily relying on sail power, there's essentially only two good places that you can get mast timber, which is Sweden and the United States. And for most of Europe, Sweden is a heck of a lot closer.
Yeah.
So you have to keep the trade routes open, and that means obviously money as long as you can trade, not money for your enemies if you can blockade them, and for that you need a fleet, or you need to be allied with someone who has a fleet. And then the final element of sea power, and we're talking about for the big navies, so France, Britain, etc. The final element of sea power is then enforcing your will. And that comes in two flavors. There's the more direct, you didn't do what we wanted, so now we're going to come over there and shoot at you for a bit, which is mostly done with colonial uprisings in smaller countries, but you do see that also in the Crimean War, because it's the sea power that allows, because Britain and France don't share land borders with Russia, but it allows them to transport troops to the Crimean area. And also, it's kind of linking into the economic warfare, actually, although the single largest commitment of British ships in the Crimean War is to the Black Sea and the Crimean area, overall, it's a minority of the British commitment, because the British send a squadron up into what's now the Barents Sea, the Arctic area. There's a whole section of action in the Pacific, and there's a huge fleet deployed to the Baltic. And these are all there to attack various Russian strategic interests in the furtherance of the campaign that's going on in the Black Sea. And you get things like the bombardment of Alexandria. So it's a way of bringing heavy firepower to bear on people who aren't doing what you want them to do, whether that happens to be another European great power like Russia, a rebellious sort of state like Egypt, or even much later, towards the end of the 19th century, you get things like the Boer War. And again, British garrison, such as it is in South Africa, would never stand a chance of fighting the Boers to a standstill. They have to bring troops in. They have to secure the supply lines for those troops against foreign interference. They have to try and prevent foreign interference in terms of supplying the Boers. And as it turns out, because they're not quite as successful as they'd like to be in that situation, you end up in one of the Boer Wars with the Boers having access to the latest in Krupp field artillery. And it turns out British Army field artillery isn't actually anywhere close to being able to counterfire that. But then at the time, Captain shows up with HMS, I think it's Powerful. It's either Powerful or Terrible, one of the two. Big cruiser shows up, drops off a bunch of troops, and then just decides, well, you know what, I'm going to dismount a bunch of my massive naval guns, stick them on impromptu carts, and wheel them into the heart of South Africa to go shoot at some rebel rebel boars, and it turns out that actually works exceptionally well, because for the naval gunners, they're looking at going, hey, we're not moving, our targets aren't moving, this is easy.
Yeah, makes sense. And that truly sounds like a terrible but powerful move that they pulled off.
Yeah.
We've been fighting Lino on a daily basis. Lino is very fond of puns and will try to sneak naval puns, terrible naval puns, or just puns in general, into most decision making.
Yeah, but to be fair, I'm not even the worst offender in our team.
No. Yeah. But you are pretty bad.
I am pretty bad. I'll happily admit I'm pretty bad. Yeah.
No, the fact that we talked briefly about the Crimean War is a very good segue into my next question, because it pertains to the impact of the Industrial Revolution on naval warfare in the 19th century, I suppose, or the Victorian era.
Yeah.
Because this is the place where you first see sort of ironclads deployed in combat, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. So there's sort of floating batteries, which have been a thing historically. The Siege of Gibraltar features some. And as it sounds, they're kind of immobile, or mostly immobile. They can be towed. Gun platforms with usually very heavy, originally wood fortifications built up on them. And then in the Crimean War, you start to see the first ones that are covered in iron. And interesting, the floating batteries are probably about the only time you actually see armor before the ironclad age, in as much as they just pile so much wood on them that, in theory, long distance cannon fire can't get through. It doesn't work out too well at Gibraltar, because it turns out the defenders just go, okay, so you're saying the cannonballs are going to get stuck in the wood? Right, we'll fire a red hot shot at you and then you're on fire, which is kind of the concern. And so when the French lead the charge with building these things, they just go, oh, well, we'll stick some of this newfangled iron plate on and watch all the cannonballs bounce off. And that's pretty much the starting gun on armored warfare. Everyone kind of looks at that, takes it away and goes, okay, how about we make that move? And then, of course, in the beginning of the 1860s, the French again lead off with Gloire, then the British with Warrior, the Americans having a civil war, so they develop their own flavor of ironclads. But the impact of the Industrial Revolution is absolutely huge when it comes to naval warfare, because prior to that, I mean, there's been a little bit of an acceleration with auxiliary steam power in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. But in the classic age of sail, a warship, especially a big ship like a first rate, could be in service longer than most of its initial crew would be alive. So you have HMS Victory, for example. HMS Victory, in terms of her keel laying date, is roughly contemporaneous with Nelson. And of course, Nelson then dies aboard her as an admiral at Trafalgar. Victory goes on to remain in service with the Royal Navy for some time thereafter, still as a useful warship. And she only sort of drops away from being a frontline warship when she's well over 50 years old. And that's not uncommon for the big ships. Some of the smaller ships obviously get worn out and so forth, but essentially with a sailing warship, it's a case of, have you rotted away? If you've done good maintenance, then no. And are the guns that you carry still relevant? And obviously, because you've got the multiple tiers of sailing ship, it can be a case of, well, you were a first-rate warship 30, 40 years ago, now you're a second-rate, and so on and so forth down the line. So warships have a very long shelf life. But become the Industrial Revolution, this changes massively. Ironically enough, the ships themselves are actually even more durable. We're now talking about ships mostly with iron hulls, iron plating, framing, armor. These ships can take an absolute beating, and that's why we have things like Warrior and Great Britain and all sorts still around, because a lot of the time those ships were neglected for decades, and then people in the later part of the 20th century go, oh, we want to preserve them, and it turns out they're still there, they're still restorable. Whereas if you left a wooden warship to rot for 30 years, you'd be lucky if there was anything left. But in terms of being practical warships, technology starts to advance so quickly. Some warships are, their keel is laid, but they're actually obsolete before they're even launched. And even the latest, most powerful, most groundbreaking warships don't stay frontline units for more than a decade. So Warrior and Gloire, for example, and they enter service at the beginning of the 1860s, nothing can match them except for each other. By the end of the 1860s, they're not even frontline units anymore. They're secondary vessels. And the vessels that are coming in at the beginning of the 1870s, like HMS Devastation and so forth, again, they're the latest and greatest then. If you look at the ships that are being launched in 1880, they're 2 or 3 generations ahead. And those vessels are still ironclads, technically speaking. By the early 1890s, you're onto pre-dreadnoughts, which have obsoleted them. And by the early 1900s, you're onto semi-dreadnoughts and then dreadnoughts, which obsolete the pre-dreadnoughts. So although the ships are technically capable of lasting a lot longer physically, as practical fighting units, their value diminishes far, far more quickly. And that actually means that although various fleets might be numerous, their actual core frontline fighting strength is fairly minimal. And you end up with a very weird situation where by the end of the 19th century, a lot of navies are hoarding literally almost every ship they've built since the 1860s. Basically anything that the hull hasn't warped or rotted away, they're keeping in reserve. And there are literally tactical treatises that talk about, well, we're going to have a couple of really big major fleet engagements with our biggest and latest ships, but let's be honest, by 3 months into the war, they're all going to be sunk or in refit. And so we're going to have to haul out the second line reserves.
Right.
And 6 months into the war, they'll all be sunken in refit. And so 6 months into the war, hauling out the very first ironclads we had. And at that point, it's just who has the most stuff in reserve to throw at people.
Right. Yeah, it was actually, you just answered one of my questions that I had. When these ships got outdated so fast, what would happen with them, right? Like, it's I find it quite interesting, but it totally makes sense that they are just kind of like almost mothballed in reserve until they are basically become...
Some of the bigger ones would have brief secondary roles, because the other thing that you would see sometimes is that you would have kind of the major flashpoints of contention. So for the French, that would be the Channel and the Mediterranean. For the British, it's the Channel and the North Sea. For the Italians, it's the Mediterranean, more so the Western Mediterranean, until the Suez Canal opens. And you might have a ship will have 5 or 10 years on the front line, and then it might have another 5, maybe 10 years if you're lucky, as in a secondary theatre. So for the British, you might send it to the China station or the South America station, because over there, those nations haven't built up their navies quite as fast and quite advanced. So it's still a meaningful fighting unit at that point. And then maybe it'll go either into reserve or into being a guard ship. But that's only really for the stuff that's actually really big and powerful and important. For the rank and file, your cruisers and so forth, it'll usually be 10, 15 years in service and then into the reserves.
Yeah, it's kind of astonishing to think about that it progressed so fast that within a lifetime of one human you would go through like 4 or 5 generations of ships. It's kind of crazy.
I think the Dreadnought herself is a good example of this, because I don't think the Dreadnought ever saw service. Like, she never fired her guns in anger, I believe, did she?
No, she's not at Jutland. She's the ship that kickstarts the Dreadnought Revolution, but most exactly 10 years after she enters service, she's actually off in a secondary line role when the big battle of dreadnoughts is actually fought out. Or another way to look at it is, of course, Admiral Fisher, the man who designs her. He's in charge for the first bit of the First World War for the Royal Navy. We're talking about 15-inch armed super dreadnoughts with oil-fired steam turbines. He starts his naval career on a sail-powered ship of the line. So in the naval career of one man, you've gone from pure sail power wooden warships to Baden, Bayern, Queen Elizabeth, Texas, etc.
Crazy. Yeah, to me it's still astonishing, even after we've spent so much time with you, where you also educated me on a lot of stuff. For example, I am still astonished at the rate of change basically that happened through that period in particular. And did I understand correctly, for example, like that the production of iron plates was basically like a big hindrance before they could be standardized, like these ships, and be mass produced.
Yeah, so iron and steel have obviously been produced in sort of the European countries for hundreds and hundreds of years at this point, but they've never been able to batch produce it in large numbers and in large, when I say volumes, I mean like as a single large plate. You know, you can make a suit of armor for a medieval knight. That's fine. It's a few dozen kilos at the most. But if you're asking somebody to make, I want a 5 meter by 10 meter by 150 millimeter thick slab of iron, that requires huge presses or rollers or hammers, depending on what kind of plate you're producing. It requires forges that can create that. And actually, as they also find later in the 20th century, when they come to making naval guns, you actually need facilities and industry that can produce stuff that's bigger than that, because your big slab of armor plate is the final product. The ingot that you make it from must be bigger than, because you're going to get wastage and so forth. So you have to be able to process suddenly lumps of metal that are dozens or hundreds of tons, and the same thing with the guns as well. And you have to produce consistent quality, because they do quality acceptance tests, and there are, especially in the 1860s, numerous cases where there'll be all this lovely armor, they'll do some quality acceptance tests, they fire at it, it shatters like glass. And they're just like, oh, well, no, go back, try again. And then you get obviously the shift to steel. The Bessemer process means suddenly you can produce steel in large quantities to a decent level of quality. And the amount of technological progress is not just, it's not just stunning in the overall rapidity and the level of advancement. It's also how, even if one country makes an advance that's a few years ahead of the other, or it makes an advance and another country decides, oh, we want to catch up, to get that equipment in and to install it and to get a factory up and running, that takes some time. And that can mean that an entire generation or two of warships can bypass you, and all you're able to produce is something that's technologically, like a level below everybody else's, which in some ways is what cements the Royal Navy's position in the latter part of the 19th century, because France, although France goes on to develop a very actually front-line steel industry, in the 1860s and 1870s, their iron-producing industry actually isn't quite as extensive or advanced as Britain's, which is why ships like Gloire have a wooden hull with iron plating, whereas Warrior is an iron ship through and through. And obviously, this kind of sort of success, it builds on itself. If you've got a big shipbuilding industry that can build purely in iron, when other countries, like say Denmark with the Rolf Krake, if they want an ironclad, they're going to go, okay, well, if I buy it from France, I can get this sort of wooden ship with some iron slapped on it. If I buy from Britain, I can get a full iron ship. I'll buy from them. And then, of course, that means another order, more money, more industrial demand. The British shipyards get bigger and more efficient, so they're more attractive for even more people to buy from. And that's one of the reasons why, when you look at the various export ships in the late 19th century, you'll see big waves of almost everyone buying British, and then almost everyone buys French when they make an advance in steel production. And then, there'll be an advance in gun technology and everyone buys from them. And it goes all the way back and forth. And you even see this in things like the American Civil War, where because America is coming out of, they're kind of forced out of an isolationist period by the American Civil War. Their industrial base is a little bit behind both Britain and France's. So you have sort of tables of, for example, the 11-inch Dahlgren famously installed on USS Monitor and various other US ships at the time. And you have tables of penetration for those. But if you look at one from 1862 and you look at a table for exactly the same gun in 1866, the values are entirely different. And that's because in 1862, the US is using an older form of powder for propellant. they can only produce iron shot. By 1866, admittedly, it's a little bit late for the majority of the American Civil War. By that point, they're able to produce steel shot, and they're using a more advanced form of powder. And suddenly, as well as using slightly bigger charges with the 11-inch Dahlgren, but either way, the power of that gun at the end of the 1860s is a completely different beast to what it was at the beginning of the 1860s. And that's just incremental technological progress that one country makes. Whereas, if you were to say, okay, well, we're going to take 1862 as our era, where we're going to do a hypothetical matchup, well, at that point, yeah, if they're fighting the Europeans already have steel shot and advanced powder. But go 4 years later, the tables are now evened.
I was hoping
it might be when ships start fighting, but.
I was hoping we could actually talk a little bit about Japan, because Japan is in a very interesting situation here. They start out with a near non-existent iron industry of scale, and buys British primarily, and then ends up developing quite a sophisticated shipbuilding technology industry of their own. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about this development.
Yeah, so it's actually a very interesting development with the Japanese. So as you said, they're exceptionally isolationist. They've allowed primarily Dutch and Portuguese traders, but even they're not very many for the longest time. Then you have the famous Perry expedition from the US, which kind of forces them literally at gunpoint to open up a bit to the outside world. They then end up signing a series of treaties, some more under the gun and others a little less so, with various European and other colonial powers. So they start to get a bit more trade going. Then you end up with the Meiji Restoration, the fall of the shogunate, the rise of the emperor, and a united Japan. And you get the Imperial Japanese Navy formed at this point. And initially, the Imperial Japanese Navy's fleet is a bunch of clan fleets and a few government ships, and most all of them built overseas. There's a replica of one up in Hokkaido in northern Japan, which was built in the Netherlands, for example. The original one was wrecked, but they built a replica because they thought it was cool. So they've got this sort of mishmashed fleet that they're not entirely sure what to do with. But one of the things that comes out of that entire period of conflict is that they look back at part of the reason for that conflict is of the various tensions that they're facing of trying to maintain their culture while also being literally forced at the point of several very large guns to change. And the Japanese decide, we don't want to be in that situation again. We don't want to be in a situation where other people can just rock up to our shores and tell us how to act. And so they start to modernize very quickly, and they take a fairly pragmatic view. Other people more advanced than them. So the solution isn't to try and catch up on your own. The solution is to acquire that knowledge from those people and then develop it internally. And they look around and they go, okay, well, who's got the biggest, scariest navy on the planet? The British, right. So we'll adopt naval practices from the British. They also look around and go, who's got the biggest, scariest army on the planet? Well, that's definitely not the British, that's the Prussians. So they, and then obviously later the Germans. So their army is a much more European continental army, but from a naval perspective, they almost entirely go to the British and say, okay, well, can we buy some ships from you? But one of the things they consistently ask or demand is, okay, we're buying these ships from you, but we also want to buy the knowledge of how to build these ships and their systems, and also the tool to build these ships and their systems. And so while they'd be buying their biggest flagship units from over in Europe, they're also building their shipbuilding industry pretty quickly. So a lot of their smaller ancillary units will be built at home, and then they'll try building something larger. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, they go, okay, we clearly need to buy another example in from somewhere else. But they're always very determined as much as possible to be as self-sufficient as possible. And so you start to see, by say the time of the Russo-Japanese War, their mainline battle fleet is mostly British design and British built pre-dreadnoughts. There is a decent number of Japanese-built warships, smaller ones, but still Japanese-built warships in the fleet that is at Tsushima. And the sort of the proportion of foreign-built versus Japanese-built, I think if the Dreadnought Revolution hadn't come about, would have switched over to purely Japanese-built much more quickly. It's just that if the Dreadnought Revolution, you suddenly get this massive expansion in the size and firepower of ships, and they're left behind again. You know, they're just about caught up with the pre-Dreadnought, and they're just like, oh, you know what, this is really annoying. Start over again. So you have things like the battlecruiser Congo is designed and built in Britain. Her three sister ships are built in Japan. And then, of course, once you get into the 1910s, the Japanese, they're all building everything in Japan. And it is quite a remarkable feat because, you know, by the time they switch over to we're building all our dreadnought, all our biggest capital ships, they're all going to be locally built. You know, it was that sort of mid-1910s. You're talking about less than 50 years ago. They were still arguing. They were still having the Meiji Restoration, the Shogunate Wars. And the most advanced ship they had was you know, something that they borrowed from somebody else.
It's a very small exclusive club, the countries that actually ended up with the capabilities to build their own battleships. We're not talking many countries, and I think, would Japan be the only non-European, or non-Western, excluding the United States, that ended up with this capability?
I mean, yeah, because in terms of people who actually build their own dreadnought, you're talking about Italy, Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Britain, the United States, and Japan, and that's it. Because Turkey has to, or the Ottoman Empire at the time, buys theirs in. Spanish buy theirs in. South America buys all of theirs. Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and yeah, nobody else has a dreadnought battleship.
Someone in
I mean,
chat.
to be fair, a good chunk of the rest of the world at that point it belongs to various European countries, but there are obviously smaller coastal defense ships which other European countries will build. They're obviously not on the scale of the full-on battleships.
Some very beautiful examples of that here in Sweden, actually. The old Sverige class and some of the earlier versions of that. Really nice-looking ships, though not quite as large.
Yeah. And the Swedes,
although interestingly enough, the Swedish approach to naval power is actually very different to almost everybody else's, but very effective. As I pointed out a few times on my channel, despite the fact that Sferias are not exactly large by battleship standards, the Kriegsmarine is, when they're asked to evaluate, you know, which Nordic countries can we take by force, they look at Norway and go, yeah, we could kind of probably do that, although it doesn't end very well for them. And they take one look at Sweden and go, no, that will be the death of the Kriegsmarine. People get very confused when I point that out because they're like, no, but the Scharnhorst is so much bigger and more powerful. It's like, yes, but the problem is if you go and take a Scharnhorst up against a Sverige, you're not fighting just the Sverige, you're fighting it and the submarines and the torpedo boats and the minefields and the rocks and the shoals and the coastal defense batteries, because it's all one integrated system of defense.
Yeah, I learned a lot.
Yeah, even the Kriegsmarine at that point are just like, we don't fancy just feeding our face into a wood chipper. We'll stay away.
Yeah, I did a lot of reading up on, in particular, the Swedish, basically the naval defense scheme that they employed for a long time, and all these factors that you pointed out were a big part of that. And Ericsson was a major, impactful driver of the monitor development.
Sweden mentioned.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a quirk of history that I also didn't know before working on this product.
Yeah, Ericsson-style monitors, although they're as a seagoing unit, they're really only confined to the United States. They are also massively common because any European country with coastal defense needs or river warfare needs takes a look at it and goes, oh, shallow draft armored fighting platform. Fantastic. We shall build many of them.
Yeah. Cheese boxes on rafts.
Yeah.
And I've actually always been quite surprised at how large the monitor actually was, because you look at it and it looks like a smaller vessel than it actually is. But once you see a small individual plunked on top of the deck of it, suddenly the perspective changes quite a lot, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it gives you some idea just how much volume, especially in a shallow draft, how much volume you need to actually support the weight of that massive turret without it just being...
Yeah, a very interesting design, and quickly forgotten also in history, it feels like.
I think the monitor is interesting because a lot of people will look at it and it looks a lot more modern than something like the Warrior, even though if the Warrior came up against the monitor, it would be a rather one-sided fight, I believe. But
yeah.
What is the reason behind turrets not making an entry on larger vessels this early on? What is the reason for it taking a little bit longer before you get turrets on larger ships?
Yeah, so the earliest seagoing turrets, practical seagoing turrets, are actually, again, from the Crimean War, from down in the Sea of Azov. The single biggest problem with turreted guns at the time, obviously they weigh a huge amount, which means that if you stick them up high on the upper deck of a ship, you're going to have stability issues. But it's also to do with propulsion, because in the 1850s and the 1860s, engine technology is still relatively inefficient. So your steam engine will work and it'll get you to go at a certain speed and so forth. That's all fine, but you won't go very far. So if you want to be a serious warship and not a coastal defense ship, and actually go out and see the world and possibly blow up small parts of it, then you have to go out with sails, and you're going to do the majority of your sailing around using sail power. And if you're going to do that, it means you need masts, it means you need rigging. All of this takes up a lot of space on the deck. And if you stick a turret down in the middle of all of that, the main advantage of a turret is it lets you bring a few really big guns to bear across all sorts of arcs. But if 90% of those arcs are blocked by your own rigging and your own mast, you don't want to blow those away. It's not really worth it for the same weight of the turret, the guns, the moving mechanism, etc. You could just get more of those guns and stick them in a more conventional broadside or central battery, and not interfere with your own mast. And you see various attempts to solve this in the middle of the 1860s. You see various ships with essentially almost two hulls. So they'll have main hull, which has a relatively low freeboard, that they'll then put turrets on, and then they'll build what's sort of superstructure, sort of hull, sort of between and above the turrets, and then put a flying deck over the top, and then the mast and rigging go on top of that. So HMS Captain famously is an example of how not to do that. But she has not a sister ship, but a similar concept ship, HMS Monarch, which is built by people who actually know what they're doing. And although she's very, very similar in layout, she actually stays afloat. That is still not ideal, because you're essentially building a gigantic monitor and a gigantic, seagoing vessel, which isn't the best. So as engine technology improves and you can get further for a given amount of coal, you start to see the turreted ships drop masts and rigging and sails, and the only masts that they'll keep will either be for signaling or occasionally to put anti-torpedo boat guns on later on. But even then, when you get to the 1870s, you get Devastation and Thunderer. They're practical warships in that they can sail out into the Atlantic and not sink, but they can't go around the world the way that a sail-assisted warship can. So they're confined essentially to the Atlantic, the North Sea, the Channel, and maybe the Mediterranean if you're feeling ambitious. But the other problem, of course, is that if you're not putting all that superstructure up top to support your masts and sails, the other problem is that your seakeeping becomes very difficult, because, again, you look at Devastation, Thunder, Inflexible, Duilio for the Italians, all sorts. The armoured portion of the hull is so low in freeboard, because you've got such thick armour with iron, that you can sail through the sea, but the minute the sea gets any kind of level of high waves, it's very difficult. The water will just come pouring over the bow. You might be watertight, so you're not going to sink, but you are going to suffer, and you're going to barely make any headway. And fighting in that kind of weather is basically a non-starter. And this is a problem that actually persists right up until the advent of both steel warships and steel armor in the late 1880s, early 1890s, because it's at that point that the armor is now strong enough that it can be made thin enough that you can cover large areas with it. And then suddenly the freeboard goes back up again. And that's one of the easier ways of working out, is this ship an ironclad - compound clad or a steel pre-dreadnought? It's the massive freeboard leap that you suddenly get thanks to steel. And the best contrast of that is probably actually the Royal Sovereign class, because although there's arguments as to whether or not they are technically the pre-dreadnoughts or the last before pre-dreadnoughts, but they're built with a lot of the pre-dreadnought concepts, except for one, which is it's the hood of the predecessor to the battle cruiser. So she is member of the class, but she's built to the old school style with big round cheese box turrets and a very low freeboard. And they compare her performance with those of all her half sisters, and they're just like, "Yeah, we're never building another ship like that ever again."
Yeah. It saddens me almost a bit to see the death of the sail, even though it is very much understandable from a practical perspective. Though I was very surprised to see it return in a place where I did not expect it to see, and it was on the HMS Ark Royal. There's a tiny sail near the aft of the ship that is used for stability.
Wow.
So if you want to launch planes, having a sail that keeps the helps keep the ship steady in the water or like not drifting, it turns out it does something. And welcome back, sail.
Wow. I had no idea.
It's the only aircraft carrier, I believe, and you may correct me on this, that has ever had a sail installed.
Or
an aircraft carrier, I say.
Deliberately installed.
Okay.
Yeah, installed with purpose. But yeah, it's. I mean, the other thing is, of course, as ships are getting bigger, our wonderful friend, the square cube law. If you're building a massive iron ship that's 300, 400, 500, 600 feet long, the sheer weight involved means that you could put almost infinite sails on it, and the motive power of sails is limited. So by the time you get into sort of the 1870s, 1880s, and you do still have central battery ironclads with full sail rigs, they're almost never using them anywhere other than in the open sea, because they discover that when it's like, if you go full sail rig with 4 or 5 masts and you're just cruising to save fuel, fine, it kind of works. But the minute you start trying to maneuver such a big and heavy ship under sail power alone in a harbour, for instance, you're just asking for trouble, and everyone very quickly just says, "Okay, no, when we're going into harbour, we're using the engines." And one of the very last, I think the last time Royal Navy capital ship comes into port under full sail in either the end of the 1870s or beginning of the 1880s, basically everyone turns out to see what's going on, and it's half how these guys are really skilled. This ship has got a really good captain, and then the other half like, but is he going to crash into something?
It's complete madness. Honestly, like, you look at the technical details of what it means to operate a large sailing ship, and you look at all the technical terms, the various subsails, the smaller hoists and what have you not, and you realize operating one of these things is an incredibly complicated affair, and it requires a really skilled crew in order to do so efficiently, in a way that I think it's just not the case with a crew on a more modern non-sail warship.
Yeah, you would think it's
there's a definite split of skills, because in the age of sail, there are going to be a few people who aren't going to be called up, but in a storm or if you need to bend every sail you possibly can, when the call goes out, practically everybody on the ship is going to be expected to be operating the sails in some way, shape, or form, even if they're just down on the deck hauling on ropes. Whereas by the time you get to, as you say, like the steam era, if you're a gunner or you're on the bridge or you're in the magazines or whatever, no one is ever going to expect you to have to go anywhere near the engine room. The engineers do the engines, and that's it. As far as everyone else is concerned, it's a black box that does dark magic, and the ship goes forward. The only time you'll ever enter the engine room is if you're part of a damage control party because something's on fire or flooding.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, we're somewhat coming up on time, but we would love to give the chat some opportunity to ask some questions to you. If while we have a special guest like you on, I think it would be cool. So if you have any questions that you would wanted always to ask a Drachinifel, then now is your chance. Let's see how many we can actually get through.
And we will use our eagle designer eyes
to
exactly. Figure out what they are.
Yeah, I'm afraid I do not read Korean. I think that's Korean.
It is Korean.
Yeah.
Well identified.
Yeah, even with my eagle eyes, yeah. Let's see if they...
very important question.
No.
Thank you. Finally, someone has mentioned Norway. I'm pleased to bring this question to you, though the answer will please me less. How was the Norwegian Navy in this era?
Well, initially it wasn't, because Norway didn't get its full independence from Sweden until, well, practically the end of the period that the game covers. Although, interesting enough, while we were discussing the sort of which ships we should use as the icons for various developments, and we got to the early torpedo boats, we did mention that there was one called, I believe I don't know how it's pronounced in Norway, but it's spelled Ram.
Yes, it's spelled in the old Danish form, so with a single P, but it would be pronounced Rap, as in like fast.
There you go.
Very torpedo boaty name.
That was one of the very earliest torpedo boats. Actually being built by Thornycroft up on the Thames alongside HMS Lightning, another early torpedo boat. So there's the Norwegian subset of the Swedish Navy, but then once you get into the 20th century and Norway is independent, Norway inherits some ships and they order more. And at the time, they're following a kind of similar approach to the Swedish Navy in that they're ordering coast defense ships, torpedo boats, and destroyers, and aiming for a coastal defense fleet. The big difference between the two is that, I mean, apart from obviously one's facing the North Sea, one's facing the Baltic, but the other big problem that the Norwegians have is that the Swedish coastline, while it has lots of inlets and so forth, it also has a huge amount of islands. And deep water and shallow water channels. So there is a kind of a physical forward defense for them. Whereas the Norwegian coast, although it's got a lot of deep fjords and there's a few island chains, it's not nearly as well covered out at sea. And of course, cities are fewer and further between along the Norwegian coast. So that means that whereas the Swedes can adopt an approach of, well, we can have a naval base here, here, and here, and in the event of war, they can sort of shuttle in the sort of the inner waters to reinforce each other and gather where the threat is. The Norwegians have to adopt a slightly different approach, because if somebody's going after, say, Narvik, and you've got a naval force in Bergen or you've got a naval force in Oslo, they're not getting there. They're going to be very open and exposed sailing up the coast. And if you're talking about another big navy like the Germans or the British or whoever, they will intercept and destroy you on the way. So each force almost has to be a standalone, which is why you see things like Oscarsborg Fortress in near Oslo and all these other gun platforms, because they're designed, again, as a kind of almost a miniature of what the Swedes are doing. Of we've got these various coastal artillery platforms, and then these coastal defense ships will be part of that. And I would say going into the First World War, they've got a small but decent fleet. Then they kind of get, it's a bit unfortunate in that they have their two latest and greatest coastal defense ships being constructed in Britain when the war breaks out. And the British just go, okay, we kind of need these. And they get turned into Glatton and Gorgon. And the British look at these and go, well, we don't need coast defense ships, but these are shallow draft, heavy gun platforms. We'll turn them into monitors. And you get some of the most classic photos, of them in dry dock, just showing how big the anti-torpedo bulges are. One of them then catches fire and ends up eventually being sunk to stop its magazines going off. But hilariously enough, the torpedo bulges are now doing too good of a job because they're like, it's sinking. Let's fire a torpedo into it to make it sink so that the fire will be put out. And then the torpedo bulge just goes, yes, well, that's nice. I've defeated your torpedo. So they end up having to fire multiple torpedoes into the thing. So there's one left by the end of the First World War, and the British turn around and say, hey, do you want it back? But the problem is that for the Norwegian Navy is their dry docks can fit it as it was designed. They don't have the width of dry dock to fit it with these massive anti-torpedo bulges on the sides, so they decline. And that means that then going into the Second World War, they have, obviously, Norge and Eidsvold, they're the most modern ones. Those are pre-World War One coast defense ships. But even then, with the first Battle of Narvik, I still think they get thoroughly unlucky. I mean, there's all sorts of political shenanigans ashore about whether they're mobilizing or not. But even then, they end up fighting in a very thick fog, which neutralizes a good chunk of their advantages. If it hadn't been a foggy day, those ships had far more firepower and actually had armor. You know, in a distance gun duel, sure, maybe they would have been overwhelmed eventually. The Germans had a lot of destroyers, but they would have made the Germans bleed. The fact that it was incredibly heavy mist and the Germans could essentially just do a point-blank ambush with torpedoes against ships that were never designed to be hit by torpedoes, it was the worst of all possible circumstances for them. But even then, you know, that's obviously the most famous Norwegian naval engagement outside of, you know, sinking Blucher with Oscarsborg. But I think what a lot of people sometimes forget is that wasn't the end of the campaign. It wasn't the end of the Norwegian campaign, and it also wasn't the end of the Norwegian Navy's campaign at sea. They kept on fighting, even though most of their stuff was pre-World War One, and it caused the Germans no end of problems because obviously the British show up and sink some of the bigger German ships, and you get the second and third battles of Narvik. But it means that by the end of the Norwegian campaign, the Kriegsmarine is really operating on a shoestring, because they actually end up getting a bunch of ships shot up by the smaller Norwegian vessels. So I forget exactly what the name of it is, but there was a small Norwegian torpedo boat, which again it's a 1900s era craft, but it's making enough of a menace of itself that the Germans turn around and go, right, we have to get rid of this thing, otherwise our troop movements are going to be a bit stuffed. And they're looking around going, well, what assets do we actually have to go and sink it? Because they start out with heavy cruisers and light cruisers and battleships and modern destroyers. But by this stage of the Norwegian campaign, they're going, well, we don't have any of those still operational at this point. So they end up sending a few of their Schnellboot, little fast attack things, and a handful of naval auxiliaries, you know, transports and tankers and so forth. They're sending them basically because they're big and they have a gun on, but they have no illusions that any of these are actually really worthwhile combatants on their own. You know, if they send in one of their supply ships that has a couple of 4.1-inch guns strapped to it, the torpedo boat will just rip it to shreds. And if they send in the Schnellboot alone, they'll get ripped to shreds by the deck guns. So they have to show up with these kind of 6 to 8 ships ships and boats in this really weird ragtag flotilla, and even then a bunch of them get shot up. So you know, to give the poor Norwegian Navy its credit, they are basically fighting with one hand behind their back, because they're only been told essentially that they are actually at war while people are actively shooting at them, which was a bit more of a clue than what the government was telling them. And then they're having to fight with ships that are, you know, 2-3 generations behind technologically. And the fact that they're still fighting several months afterwards, and the Germans are literally having to reach into their, hey, well, I guess our food ship has a gun mounted at the bow, we could go and try and fight them with that, tells you just how close it came at times.
Yeah, what I'm taking away from this is, if it hadn't been a foggy day, the Norwegian Navy would have reigned supreme and would have overshadowed every other country.
There'll always be Björgvin and Nidaros in my heart.
Yeah.
whatever it's maybe what they want. Do we have time for another question?
I would say one very quick one, because I saw it in chat earlier, which is favorite ship of the Victorian era.
Oh, okay. Well, my default answer would be HMS Sanspareil, but that's kind of cheating on my part because I have a distant relative who was its captain, so that's kind of mostly why. If I had to choose outside of that, I would probably actually. I know this might sound strange to some people. I would probably actually go for something Austro-Hungarian.
Wow. Okay.
Because some of the Austro-Hungarian ironclads they're bizarre but functional. You see some of the ones you see at Lissa and some of their later coast defense ships. That you look at them and you're like, this is a weird mishmash amalgam of about 6 different naval architecture design lineages. They are completely, their own thing. But when you look at them, they still look functional. You'd half expect they came out of a steampunk novel. You can see the underlying functionality to them. And I think that for me, it'd be hard to pick, but those would be one of them, because everyone else, you've either got, yes, it's functional. You can see it's functional. It's a good naval design. But yeah, so welcome to the club. There's about 400 others. Or you get stuff like the late French ironclads, where it's just like, how many drugs were you on when you designed this thing? It might technically work, but it definitely looks like it shouldn't.
Yeah, thank you very much for really driving home the point that I was trying to make all the time. And I feel like I'm
the rule of cool wins in video game design sometimes.
Is it cool though?
It is very cool.
It is pretty cool. I'll give you that. All right, I think that's it when it comes to time that we have for today. I would like to thank you once again, of course, for taking the time to talk to us, even in this hectic circumstance that you were in with driving. And so, thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you again and learn some more about the history of the naval development in our game's time frame.
Yes.
Yeah, and obviously everyone who's listening, make sure you go and play the game and tell us how we did with the naval expansion.
Yeah.
I want to know.
Thank you very much.
I can play it, but I'm going to go, well, of course, clearly the people behind this were absolute geniuses.
Who made these decisions? Idiots. This is clearly not the correct progression.
No, thank you so much. And if you want to learn more about ships and everything Navy, then please check out Drachinifel's YouTube channel. And I think you're also on Spotify with your podcast, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I'm gradually uploading the dry docs on Spotify. Yeah, it's a bit of an ongoing effort.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Any other platform that people should know about where they can find more from you?
I mean, I've kind of got camp out accounts on most social media just to stop other people taking it. But to be perfectly honest, the only other place online that you'll probably regularly find me is on my website, which is very usefully for branding purposes, drachinifel.co.uk. So I host on there various bits and pieces, but mostly it's a place for me to put a bunch of scanned photographs from my photo collection that then people can have a look at and download and enjoy, and a few other bits and pieces. But yeah, that's probably my other main online presence.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, thank you so much once again, and I wish you a nice day. And of course, also to you guys out there watching this, we wish you a nice day, and we hope that you enjoy the Great Wave and the next update of Victoria 3. Have a nice one. Bye-bye.
Adieu. Oh, we forgot to wear the hats. We didn't wear the hat.